So welcome to my webinar, How We Turn Compliance Challenges into Culture Wins, with me, Chloé Priestley. And over the next hour, we're going to be talking about shifting the dialogue on code of conduct, code of ethics, those subjects that are compliance related but human in nature. But before we get started, just to share a little bit about me. So just to start us off, I've been in L&D for over 20 years now, doing a variety of roles. I've worked as a coach, as a facilitator, as a designer myself, kind of all the way through the typical ADDIE model, if you like. I've done all the roles in that flow. And for the last 3 years of that, been working at Sponge as a consultant. And in that time, I've been working across the globe in retail, pharma, media, tech, all those things. There are probably some other ones that I've missed out there, but quite a lot of different industries. And I think it's such a rich place to work in that we get to see all these different organizations, and the funny thing is that everyone has the same kinds of problems, which is a really nice kind of helicopter viewpoint for me, which is why I enjoy my job so much. But a little bit more about me personally. Wicked Mania has truly gripped my household. I don't know if any of you guys are the same, but it's all about Wicked in my house. I'm really excited about the next installment. Went down to see it in London recently. So yeah, it's full on singing the songs 24/7. I love nature, have quite an avid gardener, and love getting outside and just love nature. Fairly recently become a sourdough parent, as well as an actual parent. I'm now a sourdough parent as well, which I think is probably more taxing than being an actual parent. If there's any sourdough lovers out there, you know what I mean. I'm trying to find ways of being a more part-time sourdough parent, which is tough, but if anyone's got any tips on that, then please let me know. I'm trying the dehydrated sourdough at the moment, so we'll see how that goes. And then finally, I love movies and series, just TV in general. Anything that has a story, I'm there. And you'll see I've peppered a little bit of that into the webinar today, taking a few liberties maybe, but hopefully you enjoy them. So before we get into it today, I'd love to know a little bit about you. So what I'd like to know is what's been keeping you up at night. There's a reason why you're here today. Is there something that's been on your mind when it comes to compliance, obviously, ethics and conduct specifically? I'm guessing you're here because either the business you're working in either hasn't started that journey yet of turning compliance challenges into culture wins, or somewhere on that journey. But yeah, just love to know if you can just pop in the chat kind of where you're at the moment, what's been on your mind, and I'll just give you a second to pop some answers in. There's no wrong answers as well. Shifting perceptions of compliance from negative to, oh, this is interesting. Yes, love that. We're going to be talking a bit about that. So tick. Got some other people feeling the same way. It's that kind of, oh, this is something I have to do, to, oh, this is different. Changing that conversation. Engagement, gain and maintain. Oh, I love this. This is so aligned to what we're going to talk about today. What the most impactful experience is to drive awareness for ethics and compliance. Yes, wonderful. How to make compliance engaging. Is it there to protect all of us? Not to say not to say now or stop the fun. An interesting one. Yeah, it's kind of that line that you sometimes have to tread between being serious and engaging. Can be a really tough one. Yeah, the sensitivity to that. Okay, I'm going to get us going. But one thing I wanted to kind of call out just for a pit stop before we kind of really get into is something that it ties into, especially that those first kind of comments that are in the chat there. And this is around this statistic here, which I think you'll find really interesting. So 47% of compliance professionals are just looking to meet regulatory requirements, with only 16% looking beyond this to how they strategically move the needle. So I think that is such a powerful statistic, to think that there's so many people out there, nearly half of the compliance audience, are deciding that it's too much of a challenge to try and address at the moment. They're just going to treat this as that kind of, we just need to meet the regulatory requirements, and we're done with that. So I think, you know, anyone who's been in this world for a while will probably recognize that. And if you might have seen our webinar that we did with Josh Cardoza, our CCLO, who did the 5.5 rules on compliance learning. Then if you haven't already seen that, we'll share a link to this after, but that's got a really nice piece on the kind of compliance landscape more generally. We're going to be focusing today on ethics and conduct more specifically, because there's a human element to that, which I want to explore with you, and that kind of relatability, engagement, you know, a lot of the things that you're kind of saying in the chat there. Alignment, I love that in there, it's just popped in. Value utilization. Oh yes, you're all speaking my language, everybody, whoever you are, because it doesn't tell me your name. You're all saying the right things. But yeah, take a look at this this webinar we'll share with you at the end, because there's some really great things in there as well if you haven't already seen that. But I'll come back to this statistic later, because I think it's a good positioner and in terms of the landscape of where a lot of people are feeling at the moment, in terms of, you know, do we pick our battles, and how do we choose to push things forward and dial up that 16% and bring down that 47% ultimately, which is what we want to do and what we want to tackle today. So today we're going to discuss 3 key areas, and these are areas that I've kind of pigeonholed and captured as part of the work that I've done. And I would say these 3 things are areas that I've identified that have really helped me with that strategic approach and moving the needle, and a lot of the things that you're kind of talking about in the chat there. And they're by no means exclusive. There are lots of different methodologies and ways of getting to what we're talking about today, but this is just a nice way for me to encapsulate it for you and help tell a story at the same time. So we're going to start off today with the aim, and this ties into a lot of the things again that you're saying in the chat. So this is all about, is your aim true? Do you know what you really want to achieve? What does that landscape look like? What does a compliance culture, you know, the dream of that look like for the future? And then we move into the next stage, which is relate. You notice the circle's a little bit bigger, and that's on purpose. So I'm talking quite a bit about aim, but I'm going to talk more about relate, because that's the piece that's really going to start to dig into the culture piece and how we speak to our learners, and not just the learners, the business as well. But I think it's probably the largest proportion of what I'm going to talk about today. And then the last piece being a piece around how we commit, and I think someone's got in there engagement, gain and maintain. So yeah, you're already thinking on the same tracks as me as well, about how we commit, maintain, keep things going, because it isn't just a flash in the pan. So these are 3 areas that we're going to talk about today, and we're going to start off with the aim piece. Now, what I'd like to do, again, just a quick question, is to think about what are the challenges that you're up against. And I think some of you have already alluded to some of this in the chat about what's kind of been keeping you up. But thinking about how we start, what are the things that are maybe knocking that wind out of your sail or making things difficult for you when you're trying to achieve this compliance culture that you're dreaming of. So again, if you can drop any thoughts around these in the chat, and I'll maybe dip into a few before we move into the aim section of this conversation. Just give you a second. So challenge, survivorship bias. We've never had issues before. No need to add, yeah. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yes, definitely hearing that. I think that's like 47%. Like, we are compliant, so why would we change anything? There's no problem here, nothing to see here. Definitely feel that, and I've heard that before as well. And then the last builds on what we've already said, because I think this probably is a little bit of a build on what you've already said before. Turn from the middle managers around the hardest to crack. Interesting. I'd like to tap into that a little bit more. If you can tell me a bit more about that, that'd be great. Ingrain data utilization in day-to-day activities. So is this around kind of like, how do we see this showing up in the data? And then the last, I'm assuming. last, sometimes it's how we word things. I'm not sure if I'm reading what you're saying the same way, if I'm interpreting that right. Resistance to compliance training, having to do it, yeah, not the content delivery, even though it's a regulated requirement, keep your license. Yeah, absolutely. There is a huge resistance. Nobody wants to do it. It's like you're being dragged into it. Completion of some of the compliance training, yeah, just getting people to complete it. It's we want ideally that 100% completion. How do you get the horse to water? Really tough, really, really tough. Okay, so I think there's some challenges that you're kind of raising here, which kind of tie into a lot of the things that I've identified as well. So what I've done is just, and I can see there's more things coming back in. I'm going to give me some good things to read back later, but just to keep us moving. The kind of three key challenges that I've seen kind of time and time again, and please let me know if you see this in your own world. Is the kind of three things, and maybe this is different for me as a vendor compared to you if you're working within the business, maybe have a different perspective. But these are the three key things. So first of all, is that compliance is a tick box. So as many of you have said in the chat, there's that idea that this is just something I have to do. It doesn't connect to anything culture-wise. I'm just going to do it, and that's it. It's done for another year, and job done. The second one is there's no time or budget. So even if you wanted to do something, all the budgets and time and things have been slashed. Maybe there's a new regulation, it needs to be out tomorrow. We don't have the benefit of being able to spend time on these things. So that's another one that we see quite a lot of, that there's that no desire to really spend any quality time on it, if you like. And then the last one there is that the culture's non-existent, or maybe it's not what you want it to be yet. So there's the challenge is that there is no compliance culture, there is no conduct culture, there's no ethics culture. So it's hard then to move forward on that when there isn't anything to base it on. And here's my first movie meme of the day, thinking of Marcus Aurelius when he's talking about the dream that is Rome. And I think this is sometimes what we need to think about is, what is our dream of our ethics culture, our conduct culture? And if we can picture that, then that is one of the first steps, I think, towards moving towards that dream of our new culture that we're looking for. So I'm going to talk around this quite a bit, but just to start us off, there's a few things here, I think, that we can be looking at. Now, the first one, and I'm going to come back to this quite a bit because it's one of our favourite things at Sponge. And if you've been to a Sponge webinar before, then this will be familiar. But we want to create this compelling question. And this is, for us at Sponge, somewhere we always start. And I always refer to it as like the rallying cry, the thing that is going to get people behind you. It's going to get people on board from the business and go, yes, we want a piece of that. We want to be part of that mission that you're trying to achieve. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. The next thing is those maybe back of a napkin style exercises you can do to show potential ROI. ROI is not an enjoyable thing to do, not always anyway, and can be a bit of again, one of those things that keeps you up at night as an L&D person or as a compliance person, is how do I show the value in numbers, in real data? And I'll talk about a few basic approaches to that, which again comes into that rallying cry. And then finally, going back to that dream that is our compliance culture, how can you define that before and after state? So think about, what do the behaviours of the future state look like? What does the compliance culture of the future look like? How do you feel that culture through its rituals, routines, and artifacts? Because I think sometimes it's hard to picture it and imagine, what are people doing in that new world? And then finally, how do you know when you see it? So it's got to be more than a feeling. There needs to be something more to it. So just a few things that we're going to dig into in this first section around aim. And I will move us on now to more about the compelling question. So this, like I say, you may have come across this before. It's always the place that we start, because we always believe that, and I think you'll have experienced this before from the tone of the conversation in the chat. I can tell that you're probably already aligned to all of this stuff. Sometimes the question isn't the right question. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's not the right question. So we need to be looking at where the business is today, where we're trying to get to. We know that change is just crazy at the moment and it's not showing any signs of slowing down. So we need to kind of keep on that front foot. And when we're thinking about any learning challenge sponge, we think about this. So we start off with where is the business today? So we understand what we're working with and those parameters. And we look at where the business wants to go. So we've got a long line there. And we think, a lot of business plans and strategy plans are 2, 3, 5 years, even more than that. So it's a long period of time. There's a lot of things that happen in between there, and a lot of things that are going to get you to that point. So what we use is our 3E strategy, and this is our proprietary framework that we use at Sponge. We've done quite a bit of work on the compelling question as another webinar, which again, we'll share the link of this after for you. So if you want to know more about this compelling question, how you can use it for your benefit, then there's more on this. I'm just really scratching the surface here. So we think about these are the 3 E's here: the environment, the experiences, the evidence that we need to have in place. And we think about what is the hypothesis of that. So what would, if we had these 3 things in place, what would that equal? So it becomes almost a formula for the ultimate experience for the learner. And we think about that in the context of that intended change. What are all the pieces in the puzzle that are going to get us there? But before we do all of that, we have to start with the end in mind, and we have to think about that compelling question. So this is where it comes in at the very beginning, and it's kind of sets our direction, often refer to it as the North Star as well. So North Star, rallying cry, all that type of good stuff really helps us then push things forward and gather your allies. And so just to kind of get this a bit more connected to compliance and conduct and ethics, when we think about it in this sense, we're using the compelling question to create clarity of the vision that we're trying to achieve, which can often be clear to ourselves, but it's quite funny. There's often a case of that no one's actually said it in, everyone thinks they know it, but no one's actually even articulated it at any point. It creates some direction for the business, and I'm all for that kind of progress over perfection, especially when driving towards that, ultimate North Star. And as well, it creates that unity piece. I think, especially when we're thinking about something like ethics and conduct, often you are working with other parts of the business as well, and having something that connects you all and shows everyone what you're trying to achieve from a broader viewpoint can be really, really helpful. So here's a few examples of some compelling questions that are real compelling questions that we've used on projects. And I'll just go through these examples. So we've got example A, how might we empower employees across all of this business to strengthen a culture of integrity and accountability in every customer and business interaction. So you can see there it's connecting into the business strategy and the business culture that is there, that exists already, and connecting the dots between the employee and that culture. The next one that we have there is how might we spark everyday ethical leadership at every level of the company through code of business conduct, strengthening your resilience and reputation for the future. So a different approach there that connects very much to where the business is striving for in that case. So they're all different. They all connect to different businesses with different goals, different cultures. And the last one, how do we inform, support and enable our colleagues to make compliant decisions that uphold and instill the virtues of the organisation? And that's quite emotive, that one, I think, because it's talking about virtues of an organisation. What are those virtues of an organisation? Can you feel those? What are the rituals? Those things that I mentioned before. So there's lots of kind of pull-outs from these statements, but there's a couple of things here that I think you'll notice. One is that we're always connecting it back to the business and what the business is trying to achieve. And then secondly, there's no mention of the word learning in here at any point. And that is completely intentional. And the reason for that is, again, like I say, if you're working across departments, this allows everyone to get involved without thinking about this just as a learning solution. So it lifts the whole conversation, we find, and that's what makes it so much more powerful. But another thing around this, I think, is it just helps amplify the voice of your project as well. So it can do some really, really powerful things. And we've spent quite a lot of time with people just crafting these compelling questions, because when you've got that direction set and clear, it makes everything else so much easier. And there's so much, I think, good, valuable conversation that comes out of the back of this as well, around what we don't want that compelling question to be as well, that often drives more conversation and drives us into other avenues that we explore.
And then the last.
As I said, there is a webinar all about this that you can find out more if this is of interest. But I will move us on now to the next piece of our AIM jigsaw, which is around ROI. So it is the three letters that kind of give you nightmares potentially, or keep you up at night. And I think it doesn't have to be that way. I think, when you think about the big numbers, the value, the savings, all these things that you want to be looking at when it comes to ROI. But I think sometimes it can be almost too big of a mountain to climb. And when you're at that beginning stage and you're just looking at kind of putting all your cards on the table and understanding where it is you want to push things towards, then thinking about more basic ROI calculations can be really helpful. And we call these our back of a napkin exercises, where we can just do some simple maths to say, okay, well, if we change things by a very modest amount, let's say 1%, if this changed by 1%, what would that look like? Can we articulate that? And that then starts to show a business value back to the business. So look, we wanted to make changes, and if we just made 1% of change, this is the kind of impact you might expect to see. So here's a few examples of what I mean when I say this kind of simple maths and back of a napkin exercise type stuff. So you can see here we've tried to keep them very modest, like 1%, 5%. I think whenever you're talking about something like conduct and ethics, it's about how does that connect to individuals? Is that enriching their work life and making them feel more connected to the organisation, improving on that culture? Because if it is, they're likely to stick around for longer. So is that affecting your retention, colleague retention rates? So it's more than just we're having less breaches. It's having a real business impact in other places around the business as well. So I think these types of sums, let's call them, can be really helpful just to frame some of your conversations, where you don't need to go all the way into them and prove X, Y, and Z. You can just have this almost as a conversation point to then open those doors with the business. So I just want to take a second to read a couple of the comments, because I can see there's a few things come in. Love the clarity, validation. We recognise that the business and customer has a need that can be solved by a mix of process creation, streamlining, and supporting L&D, not exclusively by L&D. Yes, absolutely. Whoever it was that said that, agree. I think what we're seeing more and more is that L&D is not acting alone anymore, and the more connective we can be as a business function, the better and the more impact we can have. So yeah, all wonderful things. Thank you for that comment. Okay, so moving us into, I guess, a bit of a broader approach. You might be thinking, okay, well, I've got my compelling question, or maybe a part of the starter for my compelling question, but where else do I look when it comes to narrowing that field of vision? It can sometimes be really overwhelming to think, where can I start? And when it comes to this, we have a few areas that we can think of. So thinking of these three key areas when you're thinking about what you can aim for. First of all, the goal. So what is the business outcome that we're trying to enable or achieve here? Secondly, the driver. So who are the people that will help make that goal possible? Who are your allies in the business? And are there any people that are not on board, like you say, people that are maybe not seeing the value in what you're doing? And is there anything you can do to change their mind, maybe with that compelling question or elsewhere? And then finally, that behaviour piece. So what do we need to change to make that goal possible? Something that I really like when it comes to the behaviour piece is something like using COM-B as an example. So that's what capability, opportunity, and motivation do people need to achieve the optimal behaviour change that we're looking for. So that's a really nice one that you can use in there. And then when considering all of that, what can we do to actually enable the audiences to do things? And that's why that kind of COM-B can filter down a little bit, because we then identify what those opportunities are. So I've got a question in the chat. What are examples of ROI data points? It is difficult to measure. Yeah, you're not wrong. So it is really, really difficult. We have like areas of data points that we tend to look at. There tend to be things like retention, like profitability. I've got a sheet actually of all those types of things that we would look to, generally speaking, like what are the key areas. So I can make sure that's included in the resources at the end for you. I hope that helps. Okay, so moving on. This slide here still might be a little bit vague looking, and I appreciate that. So if you're still not sure where to start with that, don't worry. I'm not sure if you may have already been to this session the other week, but James Gordon, one of my colleagues in our practice team, just recently ran a webinar exactly on this. It was his impact mapping session that he ran. And as part of that, he created a workbook that you can go and use as a practical resource. So that's something, again, we can share at the end, and it takes you through those 3 stages, and it's all framed with that compelling question and keeping kind of impact and measurement as a central focus. So that's a really nice tool, I think, to help you with this initial aim piece. Again, like I said, we'll share it at the end. So moving on then, before we get into the next part, which is my favourite part of this session around relate, I just want to kind of pivot for a second. We've been talking a lot about general compliance, and what I want to do now is just take a moment in the chat to think about, what do you see that difference being between code of conduct and code of ethics compared to the rest of the kind of compliance suite that we typically see? So things like information security, cybersecurity, data, all that type of stuff that you would normally see on a compliance roster. So when you think about the difference between conduct, ethics, and the rest, is there anything that jumps out to you there as different, or maybe problematic in that? And again, I'll just give you a second. Yes, human side of compliance. Wonderful. First answer is absolutely where my mind's at.
And then the last.
Any other thoughts?
And then the last.
Much more behavioural.
And then the last.
Behavioural change, personal and subjective. Yeah, can be very subjective. You're right. Change from instructions to mindset. Love that. Ethical AI. Yes. So I think whenever you've got those human pieces, even something like ethical AI, it becomes innately more human. And I noticed this myself. I was working on a standard of business conduct piece, and I almost had to stop for a moment and think about how that topic fit the narrative that we've created for compliance learning. And I think sometimes when we think of something as part of compliance, then we start thinking, oh, well, it's a compliance module, so therefore it needs to be this, it needs to be that. And that can be, I think, problematic. We've got trusting and communicating the bigger picture to people. Yeah, absolutely. There's so much much more of a connection piece. And I love that you've got that word trust in there as well. Targeted, tailored, role, religion specific. So region specific, not religion specific, just in time resources. Yes, so there's such a broad audience potentially, and the human element makes it more tricky, doesn't it? I think generally speaking, they're all about reducing risk, and they all require colleagues to behave and do things in certain ways. But when I think about it, I think, not all compliance subjects are created equal. So even though one thing touches everybody, so even though code of conduct is for the entire organization, doesn't mean that it has to be homogenous in its approach, and it has would be in the same way that we would approach something like data security, for example. So absolutely agree with everything that's going on in the chat. I think conduct and ethics are much more innately human And I think that means that we do need to change tack when it comes to this relatability piece, which is why it's the biggest part of this session today. So what do we do then when it comes to that relatability? How do we connect with so many? And I think this is an age-old problem. And I think every single client that I speak to who is on this mission, one of the first things they say is like, we've got loads of people doing lots of different roles across the world in different departments, different parts of the organization. How do we possibly connect to those people? And it's not easy, because if it was easy, we wouldn't all be here today. But I think a starting point for this is that simply knowing the policy on ethics or conduct does not equate to doing anything. And I think it's this point where a lot of learning solutions do fail, unfortunately. So we hear, I'm sure you've probably heard it before, we just need them to know the policy. And then magically we are compliant, as if that's actually the case in real life. But I think, especially when we're connecting this to culture, it's when we're doing things that we're actually being the culture in the organisation. So if people aren't doing anything, if they're just ticking that box, then nothing's changing, nothing's happening, and you might be showing that to your regulator, but you're not changing your culture in conduct and ethics. And this is again my second meme of the day when it comes to movies. I do love this particular movie, an oldie but a goodie. And to borrow the words of Morpheus to Neo here, there's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path. And I think this is the big difference that we need to start getting our businesses thinking between, like saying, it's not about knowing the policy, it's about walking the path, it's about doing the things and what that means for individuals. New comment in the chat here, compliance professionals must understand the details of the business to gain trust. Yes, we need to have that connection. If we don't know what's happening in the business and we're just kind of whitewashing it, then it's not going to have the impact that we're looking for. So one of my clients had this problem recently, and we found that the previous learnings had been so focused on kind of meeting those regulations that they completely missed what conduct could look and feel like at the organisation. And there was lots of what it is, why it's important, but it lacked the how and the who and those really tangible connections, just as you're saying there in the chat, between individuals and the business itself. And unless you have that, again, it's just ticking a box. It's not doing anything for you. So building on that, there's a really interesting statistic here that I think really illustrates again the challenge that we're up against with our learning audience and the disengagement that we have. So 34% of employees admit to skimming through compliance information. It's heartbreaking, I know, when you see this, and there's probably another. And then the last 4% that don't admit to skimming it and still skim it, which leads you maybe with a third of people that actually do bother to go through. And it is heartbreaking for any L&D person, any compliance person, to think that you've taken a lot of time and effort to create something and then someone's just kind of button bashing their way through that content and not paying any attention. And I think it's this kind of data that we need to make the business aware of and open their ears to, so that we can make those changes from that 47% to that 16% and start making a real difference. And I think, just more broadly speaking, there is a numbness that colleagues are feeling at the moment, and we've got some interesting stuff coming about this shortly from someone to watch out. But I think there's definitely a kind of a numbness in everything that we do. We're all suffering from this overwhelm. There's so much content out there, and it's about how we cut through that and create these real authentic moments of connection that then people can feel and start to behave towards. So again, not an easy task to achieve, and we are really scratching the surface here around a lot of these things, but hopefully giving you some points to start exploring yourselves. So what does that look like then? So I think when we think about how we're relating with people, It is about making it personal. It's about finding the real stories that show a myriad of scenarios, connecting to individuals, showing how a policy gets personal, and ultimately creating belief and trust. So that's what we're aiming for. And this another statistic here that came out from a recent learner study with one of our clients was that a third of their learners, which it was actually the top answer as well, said that the single most useful or impactful part of their learning related to standards of business conduct was relevant scenarios that depict use cases relevant to my role. So that was a thing that kind of came up time and time again. And for me, it's all about that kind of authenticity, realism that helps build that belief. And going back to my Matrix analogy from before, it's that moment that Neo has where he starts to believe and he starts to see the world, and he realizes it's, you know, it's not black and white, right and wrong. There's all that kind of myriad of things in between. So there's an element of getting real with our audience. And one exercise I did with this particular audience was about having that really frank discussion with the business about how real do you want to get with your audience. We don't want to maybe give them nightmares and keep them up at night, but we want to treat them as an adult. And it's that, again, parent adult child model. We're adult to adult in this situation. We're treating them as adults. We're giving them some trust, and then that trust comes back. So there's a lot to consider in this area. So moving on.
And then the last.
One of the ways we can do this is by showing those shades of grey. So I mentioned like a myriad of scenarios and things like that. But one of the things I think is interesting in the world of learning is the amount of times that we see learning as an absolute. And here is the right and wrong answer. And we have this feeling that we must tell them the right and the wrong, and this is the, you know, the black and the white. But if we, you know, spoke to compliance officers about cases that they're handling, it's probably quite rare that, you know, the cases are black and white and right and wrong, because life and people are more complex and nuanced than that. So, you know, this in itself, again, is something we need to take into consideration. So some tactics here that you can consider are thinking about the daily activities of individuals. I think someone mentioned this further up in the chat around connecting to what's actually happening in the business. What are people doing? What does their day-to-day look like? And can any resonance be found there? So this is one that we always kind of start with, that kind of empathy mapping, understanding who the audience is, what roles they take. Are they coming across code of conduct and code of ethic things on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis? You know, how often is it likely that that's going to cross their path? And then from then it helps you then start to frame that up to work for them and making it more real. Looking at making scenarios more subtle, challenging the learner to take more than one element into account. And I always like to kind of do that kind of curveball moment of, well, this happens, and then something else happens, and then this happens. And it's never a black and white, right and wrong, just one thing happens in isolation. So it just gives, again, more complexity, more nuance. And I think that can be considered when it comes to knowledge checks. Definitely a bugbear of mine around knowledge checks being kind of those 10-question right and wrong answers at the end of a piece of learning. I think there's so much more we can do to build in knowledge checks to still show that to our, you know, to our regulatory responsibilities, but be tying it more into those scenarios and talking about what they would do rather than that necessarily right and wrong. And I think can really help with this is more like a decision tree approach. And we found this really, really helpful when it comes to organizations that are very diverse, and you've got people doing very different roles around the business. If there's a decision tree that helps them make the right decisions rather than trying to explore every single scenario that's out there, because it's like unlikely that you're going to be able to cover everything that you want to cover. So that decision tree can then act as that scenario builder in somebody's mind. So if this happens, what questions do I need to be asking myself? And then finally, one of my favorite things when it comes to any learning is how you can break the script and challenge what's expected, especially I think when it comes to mandatory learning. There is such a preconception when it comes to mandatory learning, that it's going to be a certain way, that it will be a 20-minute experience with a 10-question quiz at the end. So whatever we can do to, again, as someone said earlier on, make people sit and think, oh, this is straight away, this looks different to what I was expecting to see from this mandatory piece of learning.
And then the last.
Now,
And
bringing
then the
this background into the culture piece, this all gives colour, I think, to that code of ethics, code of culture, so code of conduct culture. And if you go back to the stat that we shared in our marketing pieces around this, so like 1 in 10 employees globally feel their organisation has a strong ethical workplace culture. That's such a low percentage, which means that 90% of people are navigating these grey areas without that clear guidance. So if we ignore those grey areas, then people are they're out there on their own having to figure it out for themselves. So it's one of those, like, it's the elephant in the room that we need to address with our learners.
And then the last.
So again, keeping it back into culture here, one of the things that you want to think about here is, how do you want colleagues to feel when they think about your ethics, your organisation? You may already have a clear view of what that is, but maybe you're working towards one as well. So what could or should that feeling be? And if you are struggling with this, then you can try something like future storming, where you envision your company ethics culture in 5 years' time, for example, and then look at those routines, rituals, artifacts, all those things that are happening in your dream of your culture for the future. And then you can start to reverse engineer, and that can then again give you a place to start. Because I think with any of these things, if you've got a blank canvas, that can be the hardest part. So the last part of our session
And then
now, and again, just a quick show of hands here. I'd love to know how many strategic plans you've seen either fail or disappear into thin air. I know I've been on lots of calls in the past where it's like, this is the new strategy for the next 3 years, and that's all great, and then don't hear anything about it then after that for the next few months or the next few years, and it can be, yeah, countless. Thank you. It is upsetting, and I feel sorry for all those people that have written all of these strategies and then they just go nowhere. Just wondering, are there many colleagues who was training focus groups? I'm not sure if I understand that question. Sorry, I'm not reading it properly, probably. Apologies. Or use training focus groups. Yes, you would be surprised. You would be surprised, I'm sure. So this piece for me, and this goes back to the very first comment that we had in the chat earlier, is around that commit piece. So for me, I mean, I don't have an awful lot to say about it, because I think in essence it's simple, but it's so hard. And there are these 3 principles that I've seen, but on programs that are successful, these are the 3 things that are instilled in them that make them work. So the first one is momentum. And sometimes that's about that progress over perfection and saying, you know what, this isn't quite perfect, but we're moving forward. The next one around discipline and sticking to your guns, again, can be really hard, especially when you've maybe put some meetings in and people have started to trail off and you think, oh, well, maybe we should not do that anymore. And then things kind of just fall by the wayside. And then finally, the agility piece, and that, ability to adapt and move to your environment. As I mentioned before, like, obviously we're in such a moment of change, and the agility piece means that what is true today is probably not going to be true tomorrow. So we can make our best plans, but the chances are we're probably going to have to change them. So those are the 3 things I would say, and just a few ideas around tactics for those things. I think around that momentum, if you can have a twice weekly meeting that is really focused on that propelling of activity forward, thinking about what does your year 1, year 2, year 3 plan look like as part of that, and that you're constantly revisiting that. I think, Atomic Habits by James Clear is really great for this type of thing, looking at how we can move things forward in terms of those marginal gains, because it isn't always about big moves. So it can just be about small moves on that chessboard to get to where we want to get to. Second one there around discipline. If you have created a process or a methodology, maybe you are following something like the 3E strategy or something like that, that you stick to that and keep that in front of mind on all your activities. Again, that discipline cannot be underestimated, because as soon as we start to kind of let that go, then things just fall by the wayside. And I'd say of the three of them, maybe discipline's the strongest. And then finally, don't be afraid to pivot. As I mentioned before, with that agility piece, if something doesn't feel right, you can always go and ask for an outside opinion as well. Because I think if you're on a 2-3 year journey, things can start to feel stale as well. So having some freshness in them conversations can help as well, and help with that agility piece. So what I want to do now is just take a moment to see how this might play out. So I'm just going to take us through all 3 steps. So aim, relate, and commit. Thinking about one of our clients. So this was a large entertainment company that had storytelling at its heart, as a lot of entertainment companies would have. And the compelling question in this case was, how do we inform, support, and enable the colleagues to make compliant decisions that uphold and instill the virtues of the organisation? So you'll recognise that one from earlier. So I'm just going to take you through what we did, very high level, because we've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm just mindful of time. So what we did with this particular client and what that looked like in terms of those 3 steps. So first of all, in terms of aim, we set really, really clear goals from the start with that compelling question. And there was an ethos of that there was no stone left unturned with this. So we wanted to really make sure we had all of our ducks in a row, and we knew exactly what we were going into with our eyes wide open. And this was a very complex, very diverse, global split, multiple level kind of piece, with lots of different learning interventions as part of it as well. So it wasn't just one moment of learning. So there was a lot of things to consider, and having that, setting that as a first point was really important. We learned that we need to make some compromises in order for that learning to suit the whole organisation. And that can be a hard pill to swallow sometimes, because we want to make a highly personalised piece of learning for everybody. But we knew fairly early on from that no stone unturned approach that it just wasn't going to work unless we had a ridiculous budget and lots of time, which, in the real world is not going to happen. So that kind of piece had to be decided at that early stage, so we didn't cause ourselves pain later down the line. In terms of that relate piece, we created a story-driven approach. Now, we often use story-driven approaches, narrative-led approaches at Sponge. We find that they create that campfire moment and that sense of story and the hero's journey and things like that really connect with people. So it's a very popular approach, but I think because of this company being an entertainment company with that storytelling at its heart, it was twofold. So we doubled down on that storytelling approach, and we had these kind of 3 separate biomes, these 3 separate environments that applied to different general groups for the organization. But even though they were each distinct and different, they were all still human and relatable. So even though I'm not in that biome over there, I can still understand it, still makes sense, and I can still learn something from it. So that was something we went with. But then the final thing that kind of brought it all together was a centralized character. So we use this character to guide across all of the solutions and bring some consistency, but also this character acted as that decision tree. So they were the person asking you and almost being, the conscience on your shoulder and kind of like, oh, maybe this and maybe that. So giving you those reflection moments. So it wasn't all about, I need to explore every single scenario so I know what to do, and more to being able to think for yourself, and again, giving people the tools that they need to make those decisions for themselves. Because ultimately, no one has that bad intent. Everyone wants to do the right thing. So you're going into it with that approach as well. And then finally, the commit piece. We had a 2 to 3 year plan ahead of us, thinking about that atomic habits, marginal gains piece. We knew that we couldn't achieve everything at once. So setting sensible timelines and in terms of that kind of ROI goals, that one of the stakeholders said, this has given us now a plan for the next 3 years, and also that rationale back to the business that we know what we're doing for the next 3 years and we can prove why we have value to the business. So for me, that was something that made me feel, really proud that we'd achieved something, that they now have that business case for the next 3 years. And we are now about 6 to 12 months through this plan at the moment. So we're living this one at the moment. Quick question in the chat. So when you refer to a central character, do you mean an avatar or cartoon? So in this case, it was an embodiment of I think it was not an actual person, but a character. So it was a non-binary type character that we've used in this case. Sometimes we have a person that might carry something through, but it's not always the case. So you can have story without having that central character. But in this case, it just really sang true for the particular client, that was the right approach to take. And again, going back to the culture piece, like that was ultimately connected to their culture as well. So just a quick story there of how that aim, relate and commit has played out on a piece of work that we've seen. And now just to really recap on what we've covered today. So we had the aim piece. So a few pieces to remember here was, what does your compliance culture look like now versus where you want it to be? Think about that vision, that dream that you're trying to create, and that crafting of your compelling question is going to help you with that. Who do you need on your team to make it happen? So thinking about beyond L&D. Again, there was loads of comments about that in the chat, about how we kind of bring things on, and just think of this as not just an L&D problem. And then finally, what does your business case look like? Because ultimately, this is what we're creating here, is a bit of a business case back to the business to show this is what we want to achieve and why we want to achieve it, and the value it's going to bring back to the business. The next piece, we talked about moving from knowing the path to walking the path. That's probably one of my favourite parts of that piece. Thinking of Neo again. Pick your stories carefully, making the policy personal. Dabble in those grey areas is another one as well. And then consider what builds trust and belief in your organisation. That was something that someone else said earlier on. So something I think is we've got some more webinars or talks coming on this particular topic on trust and belief as well, because I think it is such a vital part of any training, but I think especially ethics and conduct, it has that resonance, that human touch that is so important. And then finally, just to recap on commit, we have momentum, agility, discipline. All those three things just help you bring it home and carry it forward, so you can do all that wonderful work when it comes to aim and relate, and then if that commit piece isn't there, it's all for naught. So it's that follow through that's so important. So thank you so much for listening to me, and thank you for all the comments in the chat. There's been some really, really interesting conversation. And what I want to do now in our last 4 minutes is just open it up. If there's any questions that I might be able to answer now. In the meantime, you can go and follow me on LinkedIn. It's a little book recommendation there if you've not come across The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath before. That's where breaking the script comes from and creating some real belief and powerful moments. So it's a really good read if you haven't read it. If you've read it, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. So a nice little recommendation there. Wonderful. Well, if there's no thoughts now, don't worry. If you reflect later and have something like I say, just hit me up on LinkedIn. And have a lovely day. Thank you all for coming.